Welcome, everybody. Turnkey always tries to bring you information that can help you and your organization be more successful. And we have been widely sharing our expertise and guidance during this COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we are addressing what we are choosing to see as an opportunity during this challenging fundraising time, why right now is the right time for volunteer engagement. A few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing that recording as well as a PowerPoint deck in a follow-up email and also post it on our homepage. So feel free to access it, to share it, to refer back to it whenever you need to. Also, we want this to be a discussion, so please ask your questions as they come up in the Q&A section of the webinar. You'll see that at the bottom or the top of your screen. We will answer all of your questions either during the presentation or at the Q&A section at the end. So, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Otis Fulton, who is the Vice President of Psychological Strategy at Turnkey. Otis speaks regularly on the psychology of fundraising at national conferences. He writes a weekly blog on psychology and fundraising for Nonprofit Pro and is the co-author of the 2017 book, $, The Behavioral Economics of Peer-to-Peer Fundraising. Otis has degrees in social psychology from Virginia Commonwealth University and the University of Virginia. Next, we have Vicki Labello, who is the EVP for Client Strategy at Turnkey. She has been working in the nonprofit sector in senior leadership roles for most of her career. Her passion is helping nonprofits build to the future state that they want to achieve. She has expertise in all areas of nonprofit fundraising, operations, and organizational development. She has had the opportunity to implement many changes within the organizations where she has worked, either as a leader or as a consultant. And we also have Jamie Butler, who is a strategy consultant at Turnkey. She is a certified meeting professional with over 20 years experience working in nonprofit management, fundraising, and training. Her unique blend of experience in both nonprofit and corporate event and meeting management make her a great partner in creating and producing training and leadership experiences focused on fundraising and organizational strategy. She enjoys creating incredible attendee experiences that move volunteers and staff to action through training, coaching, and empowerment. Building and enhancing program structure and creating volunteer leadership infrastructures are just a few of Jamie's superpowers.
Otis, will you get us started?
Oh, Vicki, I thought this was, oh, sure. I thought you were going to, well, Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'd first like to just talk about, these are all pictures of people post-coronavirus pandemic. And these are people at the beach, gathering together, doing things that really aren't in their own best interest. You know, why do we do things that aren't in our own best interest? One thing that humans that cloud their judgment is something called optimism bias. We have this tendency to believe that we're less likely than the next person to experience something negative. And we also hear, particularly in Western cultures, not so much in Eastern cultures, we have this desire for agency. It's the sense of that people are in control of their own lives, that they have agency. So, between optimism bias and this need for agency, things kind of tend to go badly sometimes. And I think this point about agency is really an opportunity for nonprofits. Right now, our communication with supporters should be very specific with regards to what their donation, volunteering, whatever else is accomplishes, what they make happen. People feel powerless right now. So I think that our missions give them a real significant way to feel empowered. So we got to tell them what it is their participation actually did. Next slide. And this crisis is so strange. We've had this long-standing wisdom that we have to carry on in a crisis. For the last 100 years, people have believed in the midst of a disaster, their job is to go on with their daily lives the best they can. Otherwise, the enemy will win. And now the government all over the world are telling people the best strategy is to upend their lives completely. And we just don't have any frame of reference for these times. Nothing else has happened in our lifetimes that is really relevant or helpful to us here. And people are very poor at dealing with the future. Humans tend to be focused on the short term. We discount the value of things happening in the future. Psychologists call it, we're very cost averse. When there's a reward, we respond very strongly, but when there's a cost, we just don't want to engage with it. And we're very reluctant for that reason to deal with uncertainty. And finally, I think that physical distancing is a better term than social distancing. We want, in fact, desperately to stay socially connected through this crisis. And again, Vicki and Jamie will be talking about that with regards to nonprofits. Right now, community building, togetherness, and emotional connections via social media is imperative for people's mental health. I ran across a research study in a British medical journal, The Lancet. Researchers had reviewed 24 past publications on the psychological effect of quarantine and found that it causes post-traumatic stress symptoms, confusion, and anger. It's just not in our nature to separate socially at all.
So what can you do? All these things are happening. We're all every day getting up and creating new plans, and our feelings as staff are disempowerment, uncertainty, the things that are keeping us up at night. What can we possibly do to make an impact during this very difficult time? So we know we've talked about some of the barriers. Everyone is impacted. This is both a barrier as well as the as a benefit. We're all facing the same thing at the same time, which connects us in a new way, different than ever before. It's very difficult to reach out to people because we don't know how they're impacted. They could just be sheltering in and hopefully doing okay, waiting for their job to start, or like many of you, working from home, or it could be much more serious. And we don't want to offend anybody. I think I speak for everybody on this call that we want to be very careful about as we reach out to volunteers and to people that love our organizations, that we're being clear that they are front and center of our area of interest, their well-being.
So what we know is that people need connection, and they need each other. And in this instance, they need to know that we care, that you care, that your organization cares. So here's a couple of things that I want to put out there for you to think about. Remember that your volunteers love your organization, and their passion and ability to engage is not limited to your current fundraiser or project. People need to feel empowered, especially now. I also want you to keep in mind that this is your opportunity too. For the first time maybe ever that you've worked in the nonprofit space, there's no events to prepare logistics for right now. There's no countdowns to consume time. The constant event cycle that we live in, where we never have the opportunity to take that breath or that pause, this is that unforeseen opportunity to breathe. And there's a different disruption in our normal churn right now, and you can really leverage that disruption. There is more time than you may ever have in this moment to deepen relationships with your people. Also, to work in volunteer leadership environments means that we weather them in good and bad together. So let your volunteers be part of the opportunity and creating the solutions. It's not just about thanking them. You want to let them feel called to action in this moment.
We hear from nonprofit clients and others, even in the best of times, that it can be difficult to pick up, for volunteers and staff to pick up the phone. There's a story about Steve Jobs, which I hadn't heard in a long time, that really resonated for me. Early in his career, before anyone knew who he was, he reached out to the chair of Hewlett Packard, Bill Hewitt, the co-founder of Hewlett Packard. At that time, he was 12 years old, very young, reached out and asked for some spare parts to build a frequency counter. I don't know what a frequency counter is, by the way, but that's what he was doing. Hewlett's home phone number was listed in the phone book at that moment in time. Not only did Hewlett readily agree to young Steve's request, but he offered him a summer job at his company, assembling frequency counters. During his interview, Steve Jobs said, "I've never found anyone who's said no or hung up the phone when I called. I just asked. And when people ask me, I try to be as responsive to pay that debt of gratitude back. Most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates sometimes the people that do things from the people who dream about them." So our behaviors, as we reach out to volunteers or potential volunteers, our approach at this moment in time probably needs to be very different than it has been in the past. I know that in the past you have, when reaching out, we're empathetic and understanding, but even more so now, being sensitive to what people are facing with unemployment at an all-time high, and all the things, the economy where it is, just having inquiry at the front of your conversation. The past was much more understood and we typically moved to the ask earlier in the conversations. Our behaviors will need to shift to the new approach in order to engage volunteers and to understand where they are. So this is volunteering now, as our topic says, around the US and the world. We're seeing do-gooders and wonderful, passionate volunteers are coming to the same conclusion and have taken it upon themselves to figure out how to help their neighbors through the pandemic. They're using Twitter and Facebook and Nextdoor and all kinds of things. Healthy people are eager to expose themselves to the outside world so others don't have to. This quote is from Allison McGill, who's in the DC market, and she reached out and basically posted that she needed help in running errands for her church. By Friday, the number of people that had raised their hands were in the hundreds, and by the following Monday, 1,800 people had volunteered to help out this one individual. It can work.
So now is also the time for empathetic listening. And whether your outreach and calls to volunteers impact your fundraising or not, it will have an impact. The goal is to help the volunteers to know that you care and help them feel a little less anxious and a bit more powerful. And you have the power to do this. I belong to a service organization that launched a Call to Connect campaign, asking our active members to take on a short list of sustaining members who are often more mature, to reach out and let them know that we are here. In regular life, we may be more direct in our communications and approaches about our needs or our requests, but in this time we are focused on listening and exchanging. So focus on the empathy of we are all in this together, but also remember that everyone's experience isn't the same when you do make those connections.
This is something I wrote. It's a little telephone script for nonprofits. Hey, this is Margaret. I'm a volunteer for the Alzheimer's Foundation. I'm calling today on behalf of our organizations to thank you for being a member of the community. Calling just to check up on you. How are you doing? How are you holding up? Once you know that the mission of the organization is important, we know that the mission is important to you. I want to assure you that with the crisis, the work will go on. Thanks for taking my call. So, you've probably told your supporters sometime that they're a member of the XYZ Foundation, your foundation's family. And what I try to do when writing messaging like this is just to treat people like I'd want to treat my brother or my sister. And I think that if we have that simple little rule of thumb in mind, that we're going to do fine. Would I ask my brother to come over and volunteer to clear out my garage for 2 hours on Saturday and say, hey, and if you come over, I'll give you a water bottle? No, of course not. So treat your supporters like your family, and you'll probably hit the right tone.
So let's talk a little bit about creating new roles. we want you to think about what your organization is willing to do differently in terms of volunteer roles than you normally might, and what people will need in order to serve in those roles. These potential roles will likely look different and feel different. They will also help your constituency to see how your organization is adapting and continuing to serve. They may end up morphing into roles that serve the organization beyond this moment and impact your work positively in the long term. So explore with your volunteers and discover and discuss the ways that they can mobilize. They may have the idea that will impact your organization in new ways, even in the long term. And let's talk about if you don't currently have a robust volunteer program, or maybe before all of this, you'd been toying with building volunteer capacity in your organization. This can really be your moment if you use it to your advantage. I believe that volunteer leadership infrastructure is the backbone of a resilient fundraising program. Wholeheartedly have lived this my whole career. Outreach to participants and donors, and tee them up that your rescheduled events will need increased people power when they do operate later this year. Also, be sure to share that the organization is investing in building its volunteer capacity and looking to recruit new committee and program volunteers to help shape the next phase of the event or program. Be transparent about wanting their inputs and volunteers who want to take action for the long-term stability of your mission. The volunteers that you recruit in this time will take on a greater role and will become connected to your organization in a different way than volunteers in the past. Their connection story will be that they answered the call during the pandemic, and that's how they came to be on XYZ committee or involved in supporting you. So while you're creating new roles and brainstorming with volunteers and staff, remember that your objective in this moment too is to create new communities. That's a natural that's going to come out of this moment in time. If you've seen the recent Facebook commercial, a community can be a group of people that love to play the kazoo or rock in rocking chairs. The frame around your community will look different than in the past. And it's for this moment, and that's okay. These might be communities that evolve simply to carry you through this moment in time. And they may be communities that emerge as something you didn't know you were missing that will end up serving the organization and your programs long term.
Hey, Jamie, we had a question that I think would be good to take here. It says, are you suggesting that we put volunteers to work on the mission side and then they might help raise money later?
Absolutely. I think any form of that, the opposite is true as well. Sometimes you can put them into the fundraising side and they'll become mission volunteers later. But absolutely, the point right now is to get people involved. And just like you have this, I'm getting exhausted by this word, I'm sure all of you are, you have this unprecedented moment of a pause in your normal churn. The people who are out there who will come to your organization are having a pause in their normal churn as well. So if we don't let them know that we are in need of their support in different ways, people will assume that we don't need the help.
I would also add that on the, I'll call it fundraising side, team captains or folks on your committees could potentially reach out to the people who have long-term been team captains. The volume would be too high for you as a staff person probably to do. But if you have people raise their hand and say, I'd like to do some volunteerism, it would be a new and different role potentially than what they've done before. And the role would be simply to reach out to those other team captains, see how they're doing, and make sure those individuals know that your organization cares about them.
I would also, one more thing to add, just say that this could be a time to really engage some of your lapsed volunteers. I think every organization has a strategy for this during the normal planning season, but again, this is a moment in time to say, listen, things have kind of stopped, for lack of a better term, and maybe you'd like to come back and help us out and help us prepare for what comes next.
Do we have suggestions or advice on how to engage your steward volunteers if an event has to go virtual?
Vicki, any thoughts on that?
I do. I'll be happy to field that. Great question. Of course, you're looking for folks who are comfortable in a virtual environment and being willing to reach out to their networks and others and help people to learn how to be successful in a virtual environment. So you're looking for people that may not be on the influencer scale in the old days, but people who can really be creative in their approach of generating content and interest about what your event looks like in a virtual environment. I'll also add that as you reach out to volunteers, having them be part of the process of creating that extra element, that moment of surprise. When we take our events virtual, as many of us are doing right now, just watching one another walk on a screen is probably not enough of interest for people to engage in live stream and that type of thing. So we need ways to add that extra element, that moment of surprise, that thing that happens that helps connect us, even though we're on screen like we are now. So now is the moment I'm going to ask all the innovative folks on the group to give us some feedback. You guys have been dealing with this for a few weeks, and I'm curious to know how you are progressing in this space, if anybody has anything. So we're innovative folks. We know team captains and committees are our best area of success for letting them lead. Does anybody have an example they'd like to share with regard to how they are letting their people lead?
Vicki, while we're waiting for folks to respond, I was on a call a couple of weeks ago with one of my favorite clients and nonprofits, and we were talking about this. You have to build interest in these virtual events. And they said, well, Tracy Morgan is a big supporter of ours. We could probably get him to do a few minutes. Would that be a good idea? And I said, yeah, that would be a really good idea.
We've got a couple. One says, people are happy to talk to me and surprised I'm calling. That's great. That is exactly the emotion we want to generate. Tiffany shares, letting them lead by getting out of their way. Nice approach, Tiffany. Helping them to, I'm guessing, Tiffany, that you're helping them to see where they can be successful, even though we're not planning for a face-to-face event at this moment, or maybe you are off in the distant future. That's great. Of course, as I'm alluding to, and some of you are giving us great ideas around, is in order to do this work, we need to focus on key constituents. Depending on your current implementation methods, we recommend volunteer leadership committees and team captains. Our goal is to adapt our approach to help them continue to work with us and continue to build on the good relationships that you've already started. Start here, because the numbers for your team should be manageable. Of course, prioritizing based on past performance, fundraising current relationships is optimal with regard to return on investment and keeping the work manageable. Tiffany adds, yes, exactly, dropping the boundaries and let them be creative. Great idea. Maggie also offers, our organization is sending out mission moments emails every 2 weeks on updates about what is going on at our organization during COVID. That's great, Maggie. I hope you're also adding to that a call to action for people to share that information, whether it's personally with their network and others. That is a volunteer action, having them to just help you get the word out to people that love your organizations.
So let's talk about current reality, which we've been talking about, but many of the activities we've done in the past can be managed virtually. And working with volunteer leaders in your organization on prioritizing the types of interactions that we want, and then finding a way to make it accessible and engaging for volunteers is really the key here. So let's just take one example: rallies, meetups, and kickoffs. These are typically attached to our fundraising events and activities. And there's so many ways that these can be formatted. A family dance party rally with a group of new people or an existing team. It may be focused on one group of people doing something and everyone else tuning in to be a part of that. And I'm sure you're seeing a lot of that in the media and social media space right now. And team captain interactions, this is really the moment to deepen those relationships and hear from them about what they need as a team captain in your event, or whatever that key role is in your fundraising activity. And yes, you can still convene team captains in a virtual space. In fact, this could be a really great idea to share how the organization is doing and what the plan is for the event, but also just to create that emotional connection that will continue to ensure the fabric of your organization is strong. What can also come out of this is taking input about your fundraising platforms that may help you look at your events through a different lens than we typically, once again, ever have time for. So this can be a time to really ask some of those questions, not a survey, but when we're having those conversations to say, tell me what you think about our event. If you could do it differently, what would you do? There's nothing wrong with asking those questions, and you, once again, may get some really interesting responses that could lead to the next great thing in your organization.
Obviously, our paradigm is shifting. And how do we measure success? You all have event staff, fundraising staff, mission staff that are want to know what success looks like and are striving to do the best they can in a very tough situation. Will revenue be your future metric for success? Retention, clearly, but retention to what? Relationships. Can you as a team identify how you will measure or identify how you're moving the needle, so to speak, on relationships? An online community. I have a number of clients that are, moving their events to virtual and moving online, but one of the challenges we're all coming up against is maybe they don't have an online community. Maybe they haven't engaged with their constituents in that way. Maybe one of our future measurements of success that will set us up for success both in the short and long term is, can we create a metric around how are we doing at building our new online community? And if anybody has other ideas or things they're already putting into place, having worked with nonprofit staff for many, many years, I can tell you that one of the things that the staff that I've worked with found really helpful is having a vision to build to. If my vision isn't implement my event and do all the things that I've done long term, what will success look like for me? How will I know I'm being successful in what you're asking me to do?
Yeah, I would just add to that, Vicki. I think now is the time when we really, are going to be looking at measuring things through how many people did you reach out to today, and how many people this week did you connect with that were new and have conversations with, because you've done some campaigns or activated opportunities for new people to become involved with your organization. So it's a definite shift in things. But I think there's always a way to measure anything, right?
Absolutely.
So Vicki mentioned about surprise and delight a little bit before. And what we want to say here is that it might a little bit feel out of place in this moment, that maybe this moment doesn't warrant surprise and delight, but I actually think it absolutely does. We are all seeing, in multiple mediums right now, how humans are supporting humans and finding ways to lift each other up. And I think it's honestly what's keeping most of us going at this time. So we have a client who has said, if our constituents say, I was really impressed with XYZ organization during whatever moment, they were there for me, then their year will have been a success. And we want to encourage you all to think about that as well. What can the other side of this all look like in terms of the fabric of relationships that you begin to deepen and build that will support your organization long term? So does anybody have anything on this front? What things are you doing to surprise and delight?
Tiffany shared with us, surprise and delight is the best. For me, it's all about relationships and connecting personally via phone, voice, not just text and email. Snail mail is great too. I know it puts a smile on my face to just get a note and not a bill. Nice. Happy notes via snail mail. Great, great point. We are all very alone right now, and getting those notes or that feedback is really, really special.
So, as we've said a couple of times, what we're all looking for, the natural human tendency is to look for the things that we can impact and control. Mostly what we can impact and control is our meals right now. It's like the only thing. Guess what? Eating isn't canceled.
I'm afraid to get a haircut though, Jamie. So yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Another month, and I'm not sure what this all is going to look like. But so what we want to emphasize here is letting volunteers help you find the solutions. We get caught up in thinking that we need to solve it all ourselves and tell them that we figured it out. And we don't. And actually, we shouldn't. Let conversations take you where they need to go, and you'll find probably more than likely at some point they will be asking you, what can I do? How can I help? But first you have to make the interactions happen. Also, remember that in times like these, even though this is something we haven't experienced, but in times where things are not the norm, nonprofits are generally the heart of social resistance. Or excuse me, resilience, not resistance, social resilience. Don't decide for your volunteers if they should support you now. In fact, don't ever do that. I think that that's really important. Sometimes we look at scenarios and we say, well, this isn't the time to reach out. It is absolutely the time to reach out. Allow them to be part of delivering the joy in this moment, whatever that joy looks like. And what you'll be creating without necessarily realizing it is a bond with them and among them that will emerge, as I've said, as a stronger fabric for your organization.
Jamie, if I can just add, a poll came out 2 days ago that I referenced in an earlier webinar or earlier in the week, and it polled donors. I think the 2,000 donors across 110 different organizations, and 51% said that they intended to maintain the same level of giving in the next year. And 34% said that they intended to increase their level of giving. So 85% of donors are either going to stay the same or increase their giving. I think that's pretty significant for us.
I think that's great to hear, and is somewhat not surprising to me. I think that when bad things are happening, everyone tries to rally and think of the good things that they can do. But I think that that's really great to hear. So we're going to take another poll at this point and ask, do you believe that volunteer engagement now needs to be a priority for you? Yes or no?
As you're all filling out our poll, feel free to bring forward questions. I will add, we had the Q&A that somebody commented on Jamie's comment that they were going with resistance rather than resilience.
Sorry.
So good. There's that is awesome. A lot of folks. So what kind of are there heading forward? Tessie, thanks. Other questions or feedback, things you'd like to share and inputs?
Let us know what you're thinking and feeling in this moment. If you have a question that maybe we can answer.
If I have never used volunteers, what's my first step?
Well, that is a big shift. Finger first, if you are in the socials, to start putting it out there that you organization looking for people to help.
It'll get easier as you go, and that kind of thing. Same topic on serial killer or unsavory person. As you get to know folks, I'm not going to say we've all read the stories about unsavory folks that not everybody knows they're unsavory when they build relationships with them, but trust in your instincts. The good news about the current environment is much of our early interaction is going to be like this, virtual. So really hard to, it's easier to be safe in this space. So you have a little more launch pad there. One says, when making pledge calls, how do you combat the negative attitudes? So pledge calls meaning when you're reaching out to people to be volunteers.
Or
I'm
financial
guessing,
support.
yeah, again, start with where they are and that type of thing. Our recommendation is start with engaging them in new ways, how they can volunteer, how they can work with your organization in a virtual space. We could certainly dive deeper on how you go about soliciting dollars on this type of call. But again, people who do this full time, and I've done this more than a little, is really understanding and being empathetic to the person on the other end of the call. Often, even in these tough times, as Jamie mentioned, people will ask, how can I help? And be ready with a list of what those things can be.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, Becky. And I think starting too with, for these are people who have donated before, just saying, hey, listen, I'm just calling first to tell you that you've made an investment in this organization's mission to blah, blah, blah. And even through these difficult times, we are carrying on. Your investment has not gone to waste. I think that's a really good way to frame it, to start.
I agree. And I would share a little bit about how you are carrying on.
Yes, exactly. That's what we're doing.
Yeah. There's
Love
another
that.
question here that says, should I have metrics built around a volunteer engagement to prove concept, and how do I prove this is a good plan? So my first question would be, assuming that this means that your organization has been primarily staff driven at this point, to really do some introspection about how far your reach is really going in a staff driven model. What we know about volunteer infrastructure and capacity is that it doubles, triples, quadruples, and beyond your outreach in geographies, in communities. So that's the first step, I think, improving how this concept will serve your organization is what else, what will engaging volunteers allow you to do that you can't do now? And I can guarantee you should be able to come up with a pretty long list of things, because staff reach can only go so far. One person can only engage so much and have so many relationships. When you start inviting other people to the party, your reach expands, and inevitably, but what happens is that you start to raise more money. I mean, that's kind of how the recipe works.
Absolutely. We did have one that, a comment, I'm not sure my staff is going to be good with this. How do I get them wrapped around this idea?
Yeah, and he or she means fundraising.
No, that was the previous one, the pledge calls, fundraising calls.
I think it's just engaging volunteers as a whole.
Yep.
I guess, my input there would be to just start having conversations with them and start out, finding out what the barriers are and why they think it won't work. And then start having conversations about how they spend their time. And are all the things that they don't have the time for, who eventually is going to get to those. I think that's a good place to start, having some realizations about what more could our organization accomplish and achieve by implementing a volunteer driven infrastructure.
I'll add to that, your staff wrapping their head around a new process. If you haven't done volunteer driven before, even if you haven't done a volunteer driven event cycle or that type of thing, most of your staff will have some exposure to building relationships and really leaning into that. We already know you're hopefully great at building relationships. You're not asking somebody to chair a committee or be on the board. You're asking them to do small incremental tasks to engage with our organization and to help us be successful. And that should be something that they can hopefully wrap their arms around as a smaller incremental step. And you're right to ask the question. Many folks in their, many staff, we used to use the term at American Cancer Society, and some of you guys probably still do, from a staff management perspective, a people manager versus an event planner. If your folks are currently lean more heavily into the event planning, that's what they've done in the past, they probably still have some very good skills at engaging people, at talking to people, even asking for money. So help to play to their strengths and help them to understand how their current skill set will transition into this new framework at this moment in time.
I think another thing that can come out of, when you're introducing something like this for the first time to a staff team is, well, if we bring in volunteers, what is my job going to be now? Mm. And the answer is what it always is. What is your job not going to be now? Because now there's this whole new sort of realm that has to be managed, right? There has to be relationships that form between staff and volunteers, and a staff who can help manage through that. And it's interesting. What it will do is allow for staff to do the things that they do, but better, because they won't be pulled in so many different directions trying to achieve every task because they have no one to help them do it.
If there are no new questions, we do have a request to re-answer one of our previous questions. We lost on the recording the question and answer around what are the first steps to doing recruiting volunteers and working with them. If I've never used volunteers before, where do I start? Jamie, I think you took first run at this.
I did. That's a big question to answer, and there's a lot that goes into it. I think it depends on your organization and what your organization's focus is. And, I think the first step is figuring out how will you use volunteers in your organization? What roles could they serve in? What tasks can they help with? I think you have to start with what you want them to help you achieve. And then you start building framework around that. Vicki, would you agree?
I would, and I just added, as previous, find a champion, find somebody you're already comfortable with that you talk with on a regular basis. Get comfortable and build confidence around that, and then ask them how they would have liked to or do like to be talked to, and if they have ideas on where your next step should be. So step one, hopefully somebody that either could be or is a friend, if not a volunteer, a friend within the work of the organization, and then take it out further and ask them to partner with you. It's always good to have a partner as you're recruiting people.
Yeah, I definitely think you have to evaluate what roles volunteers can serve in your organization and how they can assist. And that's kind of really the first step. You don't just want to say, hey, we're taking in volunteers and then not know what you're going to do with them once you get some of those hand raisers. So you've got to build a little bit of infrastructure first to know what you're bringing them in to do. Unless the other thing you can do is say, we're looking for volunteers to help us build a volunteer infrastructure program and be part of helping us figure that out. And that can be the approach as well. Once again, you don't have to have all the answers. And bringing new people into the equation can help you answer questions you didn't know you had, and they can help be part of figuring out what the volunteer program in your organization should look like. I should also say here too that, don't just start a volunteer program for the sake of starting it. Be sure it's something that will make sense with your organization. I have yet to work with an organization where it doesn't make sense. But I think that's a good question to start with as well. And, really look at the breakdown of things in your organization. What's the list of things that never gets done or there's never time for? And is it a matter of shifting things around so that your staff now could have the time to do those things if they had support in other areas? Or is it that the volunteers that you would potentially recruit could do the things in that list that you never have time for?
That's great. I don't see any new questions. I believe Otis or Kelly are letting us know what's coming up next on our webinar series.
Yeah, I can do that. So we are going forward with Webinar Wednesdays. So next week, our CEO, Katrina Van Huss, will be on a Blackbaud webinar around nonprofit resiliency. And the Wednesday after that, she will be on a Charity Dynamics webinar, also on fundraising. And then in May, we have some really exciting things coming up around virtual endurance events, virtual annual meetings, and online accessibility during this pandemic when so many of your supporters are online and you're reaching them in other virtual ways. So watch our homepage for links to these upcoming webinars. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Be well, everybody.